Deputy Murphy, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Neary. I'd like to return, if I may, to something that was raised briefly earlier. It's the 5x5 big developer exposure inspection that you instigated in December 2007.
Yes.
Was that instigated at your request?
Well, it was carried out. I think we might have had discussion with the authority, and it emerged from that discussion at the authority about credit and about the position of the larger exposures. I think that may have been how it came about at that point.
When you say the authority, you mean the board?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
That from a discussion on some of these matters.
And following that inspection in December 2007, two high priority findings came back in relation to one institution. But there were several medium priority findings, and I'm reading here from the Honan report, page 70. The second medium priority finding was that the inspectors noted that some estimates provided to the inspectors as to the overall indebtedness of group exposures appear to differ significantly from data available to the inspectors. In one debtor connection alone in one of the banks were off by 1 billion. So they had miscalculated the indebtedness of one of their borrowers by 1 billion, and your inspectors found that out. So what did you do after you learned that information?
That finding it was a medium finding, medium priority finding. I've no recollection of that being escalated.
Sorry, a miscalculation or a...
Yes, sure. It's a very serious matter, and I'm surprised that it didn't.
It wasn't escalated to you at the time?
No.
Okay. And would you be surprised after your inspectors finding that out that they then only held a 20 to 30 minute debrief with the bank?
Yes.
And the question is posed in the Honan report, at this rate, how much regard can the banks have had for the inspectors?
No, and I think that's a reasonable comment to make, and I find it very, very difficult to explain why that finding didn't exercise people in the banking supervision area more, that they would have escalated and we could have assessed to see was there anything we could do about it.
Was this ever brought to your attention while you were...
No, I was never made aware of that finding.
Okay. It should have been.
Well, I think when you look back at it and see it in stark relief, I think it's something that, I think merited escalation, yes.
So it should have been brought to your attention.
Well, I'm trying to be as kind as I can to the people and the process and what engagement went on in banking supervision without jumping to conclusions. It may have been acted upon in banking supervision, but I think what we're talking about here was I made aware of it, and the answer is no. But that doesn't mean that it wasn't acted upon or some follow-up action happened.
According to the Honan report, which is sourcing financial regulator files, which it can't cite for legal reasons, it says, despite this catalogue of banking deficiencies uncovered in the inspection, the full implications of the obvious lessons that loan appraisals had been wholly inadequate and personal guarantees could not be relied upon does not appear to have been taken on board by the regulatory system.
Okay.
So it would appear from that statement that the people working for you did nothing about that.
Well, that seems to be what it's suggesting. But as I say, I need to not to jump to judgment in relation to what happened in the assessment carried out by the people in banking supervision. It wasn't escalated, and that's what I'm saying.
Do you take responsibility for the fact that the people working for you failed to realise the significance of what they found and failed to report it to you?
Well, I mean, I can't avoid taking responsibility for that. I mean, ultimately, I was the chief executive of the organisation, and it's regrettable that happened.
Thank you. In March 2008, yourself and Governor Hurley approached the banks on what was known as the Green Jersey Agenda. Do you remember this?
I've heard this label attached to those meetings that happened around that time.
You went to financial institutions to ask them to provide each other with funding support in order to maintain the financial stability of the system. Is that correct?
Yes. What happened was the governor attended a conference of central bank, global conference of central bank governors. And as I understand this anecdotally from chatting to the governor, that the governor of the Bank of England had mentioned to him that they were trying to organise some sort of a pool, a liquidity pool, amongst the banks in London, to have a pool of liquidity available in case any of the smaller institutions required liquidity, and that it could have a market solution to the liquidity problems. Excuse me. And the governor thought this was worth pursuing here.
Okay.
Our governor, Governor Hurley. And we had this, we did have a series of meetings, essentially with the larger banks, to see would they be prepared. And in principle, yeah, they felt there was merit in it. But at the end of the day, they were saying, well, look, if we're going to commit to this, we need to have some form of backing from the central bank. So it kind of, it never really progressed.
So the approach had nothing to do with the fact that 5 months previously, one of the pillar banks had cut off funding to one of the other banks in the Irish system?
No.
Okay. Did the Board of the Authority know that you were doing it? Know that he was making this approach with Governor Hurley?
That these conversations were going on.
That yourself and Governor Hurley were going to the banks?
Oh, I think we would. I think we would have. I can't say that with absolute certainty, but we had a principle in the regulator that anything like that was certainly advised to the board. So I may have, as part of my update to the board, as part of the CEO briefing, I may have included references to that.
And did the Department of Finance know that yourself and the central bank were doing this?
I would imagine that similarly that would be something that would have been mentioned to them in the DSG by Mr. Horan. He would have been aware of that happening. But I unless there's a record that Mr. Horan said it, I wouldn't know.
Okay. And do you feel that this might have been an appropriate time in which to make an intervention in the Irish banking system?
Well, no, it wasn't. It wasn't for that purpose. I think what Governor Hurley was trying to do was to have, if you will, he wanted to avoid, I suppose, a commitment of public funds to any temporary liquidity situation. If it could be solved by players in the market, by having a pool which could support an institution with a temporary drop in liquidity, so be it. It was a concept, but it never really, because difficulties emerged and issues, and it never pursued it any further.
You wanted to avoid the risk of having to use public money.
Well,
so
yes,
the risk was there.
Well, at that stage, it derived from the conversation that he had with the governor of the Bank of England, and it seemed like a good idea. Mm-hmm. And there were liquidity strains emerging, and I suppose what the governor was trying to do was, well, if we could have a fund that could be utilised to support a bank with a temporary liquidity problem, and presumably they would be able to post security and all the rest of it. We didn't get that far. It didn't really progress very far.
Did the approach fail?
Pardon?
Did this approach fail?
Yeah, it ran out of steam, because I think the conditionality that the banks had were minded to seek, essentially meant that the central bank was going to be underwriting it. So I kind of fell aside after that.
You said that you left in December 2008, but my understanding was you left on the 9th of January 2009 and you stayed in office in the building until the end of the month.
Well, yeah, but I mean, I was essentially, the chairman essentially put me on gardening leave. I had essentially handed over my executive responsibilities at that stage.
So, can you comment then on what occurred between the 8th of January 2009, when the Irish government formally notified the ECB that they would be recapitalising Anglo-Irish Bank, to then the 15th of January 2009, when they made the announcement that they would be nationalising Anglo instead? What led to the change of decision, and what discussions were had in this regard?
I had no involvement whatsoever in those discussions.
And is there any relationship to that decision and to your resignation?
No, my resignation tied into matters which may well emerge in the courts about knowledge that we might have had about certain matters relating to... I'm in dangerous ground here, Chairman, but no, what you're talking about, it didn't affect.
Okay. Here's my final question then, if I may, Mr. Neary, is to the work of the Domestic Standing Group and discussions for draft legislation for the Minister to take ownership or nationalise a financial institution. You remember these discussions that were held in the DSG about this legislation?
Yeah, and legislation, I believe, was drawn up.
Okay.
I never actually saw it, but I understand it was drawn up.
In the Domestic Standing Group meetings, there was a discussion had, and just to quote a minute from the April the 17th meeting, which we can't bring up because it's 33AK, from the central bank side, it was mentioned, for example, that the financial regulator might wish to direct an institution not to pay out a dividend, cancel bonuses, and dispose of assets, etc., to include that in the legislation. And just as two parts to this question, why would the central bank be recommending that the financial regulator might wish to direct an institution not to pay out a dividend as part of that legislation?
Well, it must be that the payment of a dividend, I think, is at the discretion of the AGM, and they decide the shareholders. And the payment of a dividend is an immediate hit on the cash reserves. And in fact, I think that question may have been prompted by the fact that one of the large banks in the midst of the crisis did actually pay a dividend, and I think some eyebrows were raised that the dividend was paid at the particular time it was, even though the dividend was declared and agreed some months earlier. And I think that the assessment of the board of that particular institution was, that it was in part for them to display.
We heard that in evidence. We did hear that in evidence.
Okay.
This discussion happened before the board made the decision to pay that dividend. But in 2008, over $1 billion was paid in dividends by the banks to their shareholders, and that ended up being paid by taxpayers. So why was this power not put into the legislation?
I have no idea why that wasn't put in.
Even though the central bank was recommending to the financial regulator that they might want to put it into the legislation.
No, I'm sorry, I can't illuminate that point for you.
It's the domestic standing group. You were responsible.
Yeah, I certainly was, but
Yeah.
I mean,
You signed the LOU for the DSG, is that correct?
Yeah, I'm not arguing with you at all. I'm not disagreeing with you at all, Deputy. I'm merely stating that that discussion may have happened. It may have been a suggestion. I have no recollection of being briefed on that, and it clearly didn't find its way into the legislation.
2 minutes here, Deputy, okay? Because in your earlier discussion with me, we established your relationship with the domestic standing group, that it was a delegated power that you had given to somebody with the assumption that they were feeding that information back to you. So I'll go back to yourself, Mr. Murphy, Deputy Murphy, if you want to pursue this a bit further.
Well, I mean, I think I'd pursue it, Chair, as far as we can if the regulator is saying that you don't recall. I mean, I think it's amazing that the central bank, and without trying to pass a judgment, would be thinking that the financial regulator might seek to have this included in legislation that was being drafted at that time by the domestic standing group for which you were responsible. It ended up in a $1.2 billion payout to shareholders, which the taxpayers then have to fund.
Yes.
And yet you don't recall this discussion, and you don't recall not looking for the powers or looking for the powers?
I wasn't at that meeting, right, so let's be clear about that.
Would you have been briefed on that meeting?
Well, certainly, my recollection is that I was certainly kept up to speed on issues and matters that were in progress in the domestic standing group. That does not ring a bell with me.
Would that be a serious change in powers to be able to direct a bank as to whether or not it could pay out a dividend, or cancel bonuses, or dispose of an asset?
It would be because...
so why wouldn't you have been briefed about it?
In the circumstances that if the dividend hadn't been declared, I think it becomes a legal obligation, as I understand company law, that once you declare a dividend, it kind of becomes a liability and you have to pay it out to your shareholders. Now, I can be corrected on that. I would have contended that we would have had the powers to direct the bank not to pay a dividend before it was declared and before it became a liability. So before they ever went near the AGM and proposed a dividend, we could say to a bank, and we could put a direction on their licence, you are not to pay dividends.
You have that power already.
I think we would have.
So why didn't you exercise it? Why didn't you exercise it in 2008?
I think we had the power.
Why didn't you exercise that power in 2008? 1.2 billion was paid out.
Well, I can't recall any consideration being given to that at the time.
But you take responsibility then for the 1.2 billion paid out in dividends in 2008, which you could have stopped.
Let's be clear on this. I'm the chief executive, was chief executive of the authority, and in that sense, whatever happens in the organisation, the responsibility rests with me. And this question wasn't addressed. These banks declared their dividends and paid their dividends. With hindsight, I suppose if we had any view that the liquidity situation is going to emerge as tight and as badly as it is, that is something we may have considered. But we didn't
I beg
consider
your pardon, but you were already considering it because you were going to the banks in March because you were worried they wouldn't be funding each other. And when you went to the banks to ask them to put together a private pool because you were worried about the risk of public money having to be used, they said, OK, but with a backing from the central bank, public money, and you said no to them.
Okay, I accept that point. That is true. I mean,
when you decided...
put that construct, I can't recall that there was any evaluation of that particular matter related to dividends at the time. But I think in relation to the discussion we've had, if we wanted to stop a dividend, would we have had the powers? And I venture to answer in a constructive way that yes, I believe we would have had the power to restrict the payment of the dividends in advance of any dividend being
And you
declared.
did not exercise that power?
No, we did not exercise that.
Well, that's unfinished then, Chair. Thank you.